Witness this. A knight in white, the black cross of the Livonian Order stitched across his chest, goes down hard on the ice. His horse screams somewhere behind him, leg snapped through a crack that wasn't there a moment ago. He tries to rise, but the weight of his mail drags him sideways, and before he can find his footing, 3 men are on him. One pins the sword arm with a wooden shaft, another sits on his chest. The third, a Novgorod militiaman with no armor and a face like he's been awake for days, pulls a short knife from his belt and starts looking for the gap between helmet and collar. The knight shouts something in German. A prayer, maybe. A curse. It doesn't matter. The knife finds the soft place under his jaw, and the shout becomes a gurgle. And then the ice beneath him starts turning red in a spreading circle that steams in the April cold. 30 feet away, another knight watches this happen. He's still mounted, still fighting, but he sees it. Sees his brother of the order die like a slaughtered pig on frozen water that groans beneath him with every movement. He's been trained since boyhood to break infantry lines with the unstoppable momentum of heavy cavalry. He's done it before, felt pagan ranks shatter beneath his charge like kindling. But here, now, his horse won't move faster than a walk because the footing is treacherous, and the enemy won't run because they've got nowhere to go, and the flank that was supposed to be protected by Estonian auxiliaries is just gone. Empty ice and distant figures fleeing west. He realizes, in that moment, that he's going to die here, not gloriously, not in some thundering clash of champions. He's going to be pulled from his saddle by peasants and butchered on a frozen lake in a country he couldn't have found on a map 2 years ago. This wasn't a battle. This was a trap dressed up as one, and every man in a white cloak had walked straight into it. April 5th, 1242, Lake Peipus. The day the Northern Crusade learned that not every frontier could be crossed with cavalry and scripture. Before we dive into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy the hidden truths of history, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. To understand why this frozen slaughter was inevitable from the moment the Crusaders rode onto the ice, you have to understand the man who chose this ground, the army he'd assembled to defend it, and the 40 years of conquest that had convinced his enemies they couldn't lose. His name was Alexander Yaroslavich, and he was 21 years old. In 2 years, he would kneel before Mongol overlords and accept their dominion over his people. In 20 years, he would be declared a saint. But on this particular morning, standing on the eastern shore of a frozen lake that stretched farther than the eye could follow, he was just a prince who'd done the math and didn't like the answer. The math went like this. Across the ice, forming into their famous wedge, were somewhere between 1,200 and 2,000 fighting men. The core of that force, the killing edge, consisted of 35 to 40 knight brothers of the Livonian Order. That doesn't sound like many. It was enough. Each of those men represented 5 or more years of dedicated combat training. Each rode a destrier, a warhorse bred and conditioned to charge into massed infantry without flinching. Each wore mail from neck to knee, carried a shield that could turn aside most blows, and wielded weapons designed to kill from horseback with mechanical efficiency. Behind the knights came the sergeants, men-at-arms who couldn't afford the full panoply of knighthood, but were professional soldiers nonetheless. And behind them, spread across the flanks, marched several hundred Estonian and Danish auxiliaries. Conscripts, mostly. Men who'd been conquered by the Crusaders a generation ago, and now fought for their new masters because the alternative was worse. Against this, Alexander had perhaps 5,000 men, more than double the enemy's number, and every tactical manual ever written would tell you that should be enough. It wasn't. Here's what those manuals don't account for. Most of Alexander's army were militia, craftsmen from Novgorod, farmers from the surrounding villages, men who owned weapons because the city required it, but who trained with those weapons maybe a few times a year. They knew which end of a spear was sharp. They did not know how to hold formation when a wall of armored horses came thundering toward them at 30 kilometers per hour. They did not know how to stand their ground when the man next to them turned and ran. And they had never, not once, faced the thing that was forming up across the ice. The night wedge, the Schweinekopf, the pig's head. Picture it from ground level, from the perspective of some Novgorod baker who's been handed a shield and told to stand in the front rank. The enemy begins as a dark mass in the distance, indistinct in the morning mist that rises off the ice. Then the mass starts moving, and you hear it before you can properly see it. Hoofbeats on frozen water sound wrong, hollow and resonant, like someone drumming on the lid of your own coffin. The mass gets closer and resolves into shapes: horses, men in metal, lances held upright, a forest of them, and then lowering to horizontal as the trot becomes a canter and then a charge. The wedge hits infantry the way a splitting maul hits a log. The point, formed by the best armored knights, punches through whatever resistance it meets. The widening body behind the point peels that wound open, left and right, turning a small gap into a catastrophic breach. And once the formation is broken, once men start running instead of fighting, the cavalry hunts them down like dogs chasing rabbits. This had worked for 40 years. Livonians, Estonians, Curonians, Semigallians, Prussians. Pagan tribes and petty kingdoms had fallen before the wedge, one after another, because they had no answer to it. Their warriors were brave. Their courage did not matter. You cannot fight physics with valor. A 600-kilogram mass moving at speed will destroy whatever stands in its path unless that thing is willing to die without moving. And most men, when the moment comes, are not willing to die without moving. Alexander knew this. He'd studied the Crusader campaigns, knew their doctrine, understood exactly what would happen if he met them on an open field with his militia forming the battle line. They would break, they would run, and his druzhina, his small corps of professional cavalry, would be swarmed and slaughtered trying to cover the retreat. So he didn't give them an open field. He gave them a frozen lake in early April when the ice near the shore was still thick enough to hold weight, but the surface had become treacherous with melt, when a horse that tried to gallop would slip and stumble, when a charge that relied on momentum would find that momentum bleeding away into the slick, uncertain footing beneath. He positioned his militia at the shoreline, on solid ground, with their backs to rocks and trees instead of empty space. He told them one thing: hold. Don't break the enemy. Don't win. Just hold. And he kept his druzhina, his professional cavalry, hidden on the flanks, waiting, watching for the moment when the wedge had committed, when it had driven into the militia line and couldn't pull back, when all that crushing momentum had been spent on infantry, who were dying but not running. Then the flanks would close like the jaws of a trap. At least, that was the plan. Plans are easy. Standing in the front rank while a Crusader charge bears down on you, trusting that your prince has calculated correctly, trusting that the men beside you won't run and leave you alone to face the lances. That's not a plan. That's a prayer. Dawn came gray and cold. The ice stretched out before the Russian line like a vast white floor, deceptively solid-looking, groaning occasionally with sounds that carried for hundreds of meters in the still air. Across that floor, the Livonian force assembled into formation. The Knight brothers took their positions at the point of the wedge. The sergeants fell in behind them. The auxiliaries spread to the flanks. No speeches, no dramatic proclamations. Just the quiet sounds of men preparing to kill or die. Metal shifting against metal. Horses stamping. Prayers muttered in 3 different languages. Then the wedge started forward. Alexander watched from elevated ground on the eastern shore. He could see his militia, thousands of them packed along the shoreline. He could see them shifting, weapons raised but feet uncertain. He could see them watching the approaching wedge with the same expression he'd seen on the faces of sheep when wolves appear at the edge of the pasture. He did not reinforce the center. He did not ride down to steady them with his presence. He stayed where he was, watching, waiting for the moment when intervention would matter. Some of those men in the front rank were going to die. He knew that. He'd known it when he positioned them there, when he told them to hold no matter what. Their deaths would buy time. Their deaths would spend the Crusaders' momentum. And when the killing was done, if his calculation was correct, there would be a Russia left for the survivors to live in. If he was wrong, there wouldn't be. The wedge reached the shoreline. Forward, for Christ and the Order. Lances struck shields. Men fell. The screaming began. But while the wedge punched into the Russian center, while militiamen died under hooves and blades, while the front rank crumpled and the second rank stumbled back to fill the gaps, something else was happening on the flanks. The Estonian auxiliaries, conscripts fighting for masters they didn't love, looked to their left and right and saw Russian cavalry emerging from concealed positions. Professional warriors, fresh, mounted on horses that hadn't just spent their energy crossing a frozen lake. The auxiliaries didn't run immediately, but they hesitated. And in battle, hesitation is just running in slow motion. By the time the Knight brothers in the wedge realized their flanks were collapsing, it was too late. They'd driven deep into the militia line, killed dozens, broken the formation in places, done everything they were supposed to do. But the militia hadn't routed. The militia was still there, still fighting, still pressing back. And now, there were enemies on 3 sides instead of 1. The wedge had become a coffin with no lid. What followed wasn't a battle anymore. It was a butchering, conducted on ice that cracked and groaned under the weight of concentrated violence, that grew slick with blood, that in places gave way entirely and swallowed men whose armor became their death sentence the instant they hit water. 20 Knight brothers died that day. 6 more were captured. For the Livonian Order, a force that probably had no more than 80 Knight brothers total in that region, this was catastrophic. 40 years of conquest, hundreds of kilometers of territory absorbed, dozens of fortresses built, tens of thousands of pagans converted at sword point, and now nearly half of their professional warriors were gone in a single afternoon because a 21-year-old prince had read the ground better than they had. The battle was over by noon. The pursuit continued for 7 kilometers across the ice. Russian cavalry hunting down the fleeing remnants of the Crusader force, killing some, capturing others, letting a few escape to carry word back to Livonia of what had happened. Alexander stood on the shore when it was done, surrounded by the aftermath. Dead men in white cloaks, dead horses, dead militiamen who'd held when holding meant dying. The ice was stained in expanding patches of red and brown, steam rising where hot blood met frozen water. He'd won. Completely. Decisively. The kind of victory that ends campaigns and redraws maps. And now came the part that the songs wouldn't mention, the calculation that the Chronicles would gloss over, the decision that would define him far more than any battle. He could advance, and the Livonian Order was shattered, their best men dead or captured, their remaining forces scattered and demoralized. He could push west, take the fortresses they'd built, roll back 40 years of Crusader conquest in a season. He didn't. He gathered his army, collected his prisoners, and marched back to Novgorod, negotiated a peace treaty that restored the pre-war borders, and nothing more. Let the Crusaders keep what they'd already taken. Let them rebuild, rearm, recover. Why? Because 1,500 kilometers to the east, a different kind of conqueror was watching. And that conqueror didn't negotiate, didn't sign treaties, didn't recognize borders. Alexander could fight the Crusaders because he'd already knelt to the Mongols. That submission bought him the freedom to turn west and defend his territory. But submission required maintenance, required tribute, required the prince to appear before the Khan when summoned, to bow, to demonstrate his continued loyalty. He couldn't afford a long campaign in the west, couldn't afford to stretch his forces, deplete his treasury, spend months or years grinding down Livonian fortresses while the Mongol envoys waited for their payments. The battle on the ice was a victory, yes, but it was a victory snatched in the narrow window between one existential threat and another. That's who Alexander Nevsky was, not the folk hero of later centuries, riding in triumph against the invaders. A young man with enemies on two fronts and resources for neither, making impossible choices, sacrificing what he had to sacrifice, surviving. But before we meet the man in full, before we understand the calculation that put him on that frozen lake with an army of militiamen and a gamble, we need to understand the machine that sent those knights east in the first place. Because the Livonian Order didn't attack Novgorod on a whim. They attacked because for 40 years, attacking had worked. Because every pagan tribe that stood against them had fallen. Because the Northern Crusade was a system, a bureaucracy of holy violence that had never learned how to lose. To understand why those knights rode onto the ice expecting victory, even outnumbered, even on treacherous ground, you have to understand what had made them so certain. And that story starts in a converted warehouse in Acre, 50 years earlier, where a group of German merchants decided to build a hospital, then an army, then an empire. The story you've heard goes something like this. Brave Christian knights rode east to spread the faith, encountered savage resistance from pagans and schismatics, and fought holy wars to bring civilization to the wilderness. It's a clean narrative. It's also a lie wrapped in a chapel and sold as history. The Northern Crusade wasn't about salvation. It was about real estate. By 1240, the military orders operating in the Baltic had absorbed more territory in 40 years than the Roman Empire had managed in a century. Not because they were holier than their enemies, not because God favored their cause, because they had invented something genuinely new, a corporation that could conquer. To understand the machine that would eventually grind to a halt on Lake Peipus, you have to see it clearly, without the stained glass. You have to understand what it ate, how it grew, and why the men who ran it genuinely believed they couldn't be stopped. Start with geography. The Baltic coast in the 12th century was Europe's last pagan frontier. While kingdoms to the south had been Christian for generations, the tribes along the eastern shore of the Baltic Sea still sacrificed to gods whose names the chroniclers couldn't spell. Livonians, Estonians, Curonians, Semigallians, Prussians, Lithuanians. Dozens of distinct peoples spread across dense forests and marshy lowlands, united by nothing except their refusal to accept the cross. To the German bishops and merchants looking east from their comfortable cathedral towns, This represented both a spiritual problem and an economic opportunity. The problem: unbaptized souls going to hell. The opportunity: those souls were sitting on some of the finest amber deposits in Europe, controlling river routes that connected the Baltic to the interior of the continent, occupying farmland that could be settled by German colonists if someone would just clear away the current inhabitants. The Pope obliged. Beginning in 1198, a series of papal bulls authorized crusade against the Baltic pagans. The rewards were familiar from the Holy Land campaigns: remission of sins, spiritual credit, the chance to kill without guilt. But the Baltic offered something Jerusalem couldn't: real estate you could keep. In the Holy Land, Crusaders had to hold territory against an Islamic world that outnumbered them catastrophically. Even at their peak, the Crusader states were a thin coastal strip backed against the sea. The Baltic was different. Here, the pagans were fragmented, isolated, technologically outmatched. A castle built in Prussia or Livonia wasn't a desperate outpost. It was an anchor for permanent colonization. The Teutonic Order understood this better than anyone. They'd started in the Holy Land, founded around 1190 as a hospital for German pilgrims in Acre. Within a generation, they'd transformed into a military order modeled on the Templars, complete with a hierarchy of knights, sergeants, and priests bound by religious vows. But unlike the Templars, who stayed focused on the Mediterranean, the Teutonic Knights recognized that the future lay north. In 1226, a Polish duke named Conrad of Masovia offered them a deal. He'd been fighting the pagan Prussians for years, getting nowhere. Would the order like to take over the problem in exchange for whatever territory they could conquer? They would. What followed was 40 years of systematic conquest that would serve as a template for colonial expansion for centuries afterward. The order developed a method, and the method worked. First, build a fortress at the edge of pagan territory. Not a simple wooden palisade, but a stone castle, garrisoned with professional soldiers, supplied by river or sea. Then use that fortress as a base for raids into the surrounding countryside. Burn villages, seize hostages, destroy crops. Make submission less costly than resistance. When a tribe surrendered, don't slaughter them. Convert them. Baptize their leaders. Record the event. Establish a church. Tax the survivors. Conscript their young men for the next campaign. And then build another fortress, a little farther east, and repeat. This was the Crusade as business model. The inputs were knights from Germany, colonists from the Low Countries, money from merchants who wanted access to Baltic trade. The outputs were territory, tribute, and souls counted in baptismal registers that justified the whole enterprise to Rome. The Livonian branch of this operation, known as the Livonian Order, had been grinding through the eastern Baltic since the early 1200s. By 1240, they'd conquered most of what is now Estonia and Latvia. Their fortresses dotted the coastline from Riga to Reval. Their bishops administered dioceses carved from former tribal lands. Their merchants controlled the river trade that flowed from the Russian interior through Novgorod and Pskov to the Baltic ports. That trade was the key. Novgorod was the richest city in northern Russia, a merchant republic that dealt in furs, wax, and honey from the forests of the interior. Pskov, 30 kilometers from Livonian territory, was Novgorod's western outpost, the gateway through which that wealth flowed toward European markets. Whoever controlled Pskov controlled the tap. Whoever controlled Novgorod controlled the source. The order had been eyeing this prize for decades. But as long as Novgorod remained unified and strong, the risk wasn't worth the potential gain. The city could field thousands of militia, could call on reinforcements from the other Russian principalities, could make any invasion expensive enough to deter. Then, in 1240, everything changed. Not because of anything the Crusaders did, because of the Mongols. 2,000 kilometers to the east, the armies of Batu Khan had just finished the most devastating military campaign in European history. In less than 3 years, they destroyed the kingdoms of Volga, Bulgaria, Vladimir Suzdal, Ryazan, and a dozen smaller principalities. They'd burned Kiev, the ancient capital of the Rus, to the ground. They'd annihilated a combined Polish-German army at Legnica and a Hungarian army at Mohi in the span of 2 days. The Russian principalities that survived did so by submitting. Alexander's father, Yaroslav, had traveled to the Mongol court and knelt before Batu Khan, accepting tributary status in exchange for the right to continue ruling. The price was steep: annual payments in silver and furs, military service when demanded, the understanding that any resistance would bring annihilation. This was the world Alexander Yaroslavich inherited. A Russia broken and bleeding from Mongol conquest, its princes reduced to tax collectors for foreign overlords, its cities still smoldering from campaigns that had killed hundreds of thousands, and in the west, a Crusader machine that smelled weakness the way sharks smell blood. From Riga, from Dorpat, from Reval, the reports flowed in. The Russian princes were vassals now, their armies depleted, their treasuries emptied by Mongol tribute. Novgorod stood alone, unconquered by the Mongols, but surrounded by submission, and Novgorod had just expelled its prince. To Hermann von Buxtehude, Bishop of Dorpat, this looked like opportunity wearing a convenient disguise. Hermann wasn't a warrior. He was an administrator, a man who'd risen through the ecclesiastical bureaucracy to one of the Baltic's most powerful positions. His diocese sat on the frontier, directly across from Pskov, and he'd spent years watching the Russian trade flow past his territory toward Novgorod's warehouses. He understood incentives the way a merchant understands ledgers, and the incentive structure in 1240 was clearer than it had ever been. The Russians were weak. Their protector had been expelled. Their neighbors had submitted to pagans from the steppe, and the Order had just absorbed another chunk of Estonian territory, freeing up men and resources for new ventures. The bishop didn't need to conquer Novgorod himself. He just needed a foothold. Pskov first, then Koporye on the Gulf of Finland, then the villages in between. Establish facts on the ground, build fortifications, wait for Novgorod to fragment further, or accept terms, and the same method that had worked against the Livonians and Estonians and Curonians would work against the Russians. There was no reason to think otherwise. God has delivered the schismatics into confusion, he reportedly told his counselors. What remains is simply to gather what he has prepared. The confidence wasn't arrogance, it was pattern recognition. 40 years of unbroken success does something to an institution's capacity for self-doubt. Every tribe that had stood against the Order had fallen. Every time the method had been tested, it had worked. The Russians were just the next entry in a long ledger of conquests, notable only for their wealth. What Hermann didn't understand, what he couldn't understand from his cathedral in Dorpat, was that Novgorod wasn't a tribe. It was a machine of its own, with its own logic, in its own survival mechanisms, and its own prince waiting in exile for exactly this moment. Alexander Yaroslavich had been 16 when the Mongols came, old enough to understand what was happening, young enough to be helpless before it. He'd watched his father ride east to kneel before Batu Khan. He'd seen the refugees streaming west from burned cities, carrying stories of massacres that defied belief. He'd learned, in those years, the first hard lesson of Russian survival. Some enemies cannot be fought. They can only be endured. But the Crusaders weren't Mongols. They didn't have endless reserves of steppe cavalry. didn't command an empire stretching from Korea to Poland, didn't possess the kind of overwhelming force that made resistance meaningless. The Crusaders were dangerous, yes, skilled, equipped, experienced, but they were also limited. A few hundred knights, a few thousand auxiliaries, a territorial appetite that exceeded their digestive capacity. They could be fought. More importantly, they had to be fought, because the alternative was worse than battle. The Mongols demanded tribute and submission, but left the Orthodox Church alone. The Crusaders demanded conversion, absorption into the Latin Rite. The end of everything that made Novgorod what it was. Alexander had already proven he could fight. In July 1240, just months before the Crusader incursion began, a Swedish force had sailed up the Neva River toward Novgorod's territory. The details are contested, inflated by later chronicle accounts, but the core is documented. Alexander led a rapid strike against the Swedish camp, killed their commander, drove the survivors back to their ships. He earned his name that day, Nevsky, of the Neva. And Novgorod, in its infinite political wisdom, expelled him 3 months later. This is the part that matters, the part that reveals who he actually was. Not the battle, the exile. Because a different kind of man would have raged, would have raised troops from his father's territory and marched back to claim what was his. Alexander didn't. He went to his father's lands in Pereslavel, maintained his household, waited. He understood something that most 20-year-olds don't. Necessity has a schedule of its own. Novgorod had expelled him because a victorious prince was a threat to merchant autonomy. Eventually, Novgorod would face a threat that its merchants couldn't buy off. When that happened, they would need him more than he needed them. Winter 1240 into 1241. The Crusaders moved. Pskov fell without a siege because a faction of boyars opened the gates, preferring German overlordship to Novgorod's meddling. Livonian forces pushed east, established an outpost at Koporye, began raiding the countryside around Novgorod itself. 30 kilometers from the city walls, German knights were burning villages, seizing livestock, demonstrating what submission would cost and what resistance would invite. The vetch met. The assembly bell rang, and the citizens of Novgorod gathered to debate their survival. The merchants who'd expelled Alexander argued for negotiation, for finding terms, for the kind of pragmatic accommodation that had built their wealth. But you can't negotiate from a position of total weakness, and Novgorod in early 1241 had nothing to negotiate with except the threat of resistance it hadn't yet demonstrated. And the message went to Yaroslav's court in late winter. Not to Alexander directly, a small preservation of civic dignity. To his father, with the understanding that the son would be sent. Yaroslav sent him, but he didn't send him alone. He sent Druzhina, professional cavalry from his own forces, warriors who'd trained together and fought together and wouldn't break at the first shock. This was the gift that would matter. Not Alexander's name, or his lineage, or his previous victory. Soldiers who knew their business. Alexander returned to Novgorod in 1241, but not as the exile come home with his tail between his legs. He came as a contractor with leverage. The terms aren't recorded, but his subsequent freedom of action suggests he'd extracted concessions. Operational authority without interference. Resources without accounting, on the understanding that this time he commanded. His first move, Koporye. The Crusader forward base had to go. He took it in late 1241, dismantled the fortifications, dealt with the garrison in ways the Chronicles describe with grim brevity. Some Estonian auxiliaries who'd served the Crusaders were hanged. Others were sent home as a message. The fortress itself was razed so thoroughly that nothing remained for the enemy to reoccupy. His second move, Pskov, the city that had betrayed Novgorod, that had welcomed the Crusaders as liberators from Russian meddling. March 1242. Alexander's force appeared before the walls, and whatever German garrison remained chose not to test the fortifications against a prince who'd already demonstrated what he did to collaborators. The city fell. The German administrators were captured, and the Russian boyars who'd opened the gates. The Chronicles don't say. They didn't need to say. 2 cities reclaimed in 6 months. The Crusader advance not just stopped, but reversed. And still, Alexander didn't stop. Instead of consolidating, fortifying, digging in to defend his gains, he pushed forward, into Livonian territory, raiding, probing, forcing the enemy to respond. This is where genius or madness enters the calculation. A cautious commander would have held Pskov and waited. Let the Crusaders come to him, break themselves against walls and Russian winter. Alexander did the opposite. He marched his army west toward the enemy's heartland, daring them to meet him in the field. Why? Because he understood the Crusader decision-making process better than they understood themselves. The order couldn't ignore a Russian force raiding Livonian territory. Their entire system depended on the perception of invincibility. Let a Russian prince burn villages and retreat unpunished, and every conquered people in the Baltic would start reconsidering their submission. The Crusaders had to respond, had to field an army, had to be seen crushing this upstart who dared challenge them. Alexander was counting on it. He wanted them to come out, wanted them angry, confident, eager to demonstrate that the natural order still held. Because the only way to break the Crusader advance permanently was to break the Crusaders themselves, not raid them and retreat, not negotiate a peace they'd violate in a generation, destroy them so completely that the survivors would never try again. The question was where? On what ground could militia stand against knights? In what place could numbers matter more than training? Where terrain would neutralize the crushing weight of heavy cavalry? He found his answer in early April, watching the ice on Lake Peipus catch the morning light. Still frozen, but not for long. Spring was coming, and with it the thaw that would make the lake impassable. A narrow window, a few weeks at most. If the Crusaders wanted to fight before summer, they'd have to cross that ice, and on the ice, everything that made them fearsome became a liability. Heavy horses slipping on frozen water, concentrated formations cracking through thin spots. The momentum of the charge bled away into treacherous footing. Alexander positioned his army on the eastern shore and waited for the enemy to commit. "Let them come to us on the ice," he told his commanders. "Let them come heavy and confident. The lake will teach them what their trainers never did." Across the lake, the Crusaders were mustering. The Livonian Knight Brothers, 35 or 40 of them, the killing edge of any force they joined. The sergeants and men-at-arms, professionals who'd served in a dozen campaigns against pagan tribes, who fought much like the Russians fought. The Estonian and Danish auxiliaries, hundreds of them, conscripts and opportunists filling out the ranks. Bishop Herman's own diocesan levies, eager to share in whatever plunder a victory might bring. Between 1,500 and 2,000 men, depending on whose count you trust. A modest army by European standards. More than enough for the mission at hand, by the standards of 40 years of crusading success. They knew Alexander was waiting for them. Scouts had tracked his movement to the eastern shore, reported his numbers, estimated his composition. The druzhina on the flanks, the militia in the center, the whole force arrayed along a stretch of shoreline near a landmark the Russians called Raven's Rock. The Crusader commanders debated briefly and concluded what their experience dictated. The Russians had more men, but fewer professionals. Their cavalry was outnumbered by the knight brothers and sergeants. Their infantry was militia who would break when charged, the way militia always broke when charged. The battle would be decided in 15 minutes, maybe less. The wedge would shatter the center, the flanks would collapse. The pursuit would continue until the survivors reached Novgorod's walls. Standard doctrine, proven method, no reason to deviate. On the night of April 4th, the Livonian army camped on the western shore of Lake Peipus. They held mass, heard confessions, prepared their souls for the killing work ahead. The Knight brothers checked their equipment one final time. Mail oiled against rust, swords sharpened, horses fed and watered. Some probably slept, others probably prayed. Across the ice, Alexander's army made its own preparations. Militia sharpening spears that had never tasted blood. Druzhina cavalrymen checking girths and bridles, speaking quietly to horses that sensed their riders' tension. Orthodox priests moving through the camp with icons, blessing men who might not see another sunset. Alexander himself walked the shoreline in the darkness, studying the ice, the approaches, the ground where his militia would stand. He was 21 years old. He'd expelled Crusaders from 2 cities and raided their territory with impunity. But he'd never commanded a pitched battle against the night wedge, never tested his plan against the weapon that had broken every enemy it faced. Tomorrow he'd find out if he was right, if the ice would hold long enough to trap the enemy and thin enough to slow their charge, if his militia would stand when the lances lowered, if his Druzhina could close the trap before the knights cut their way free. If he was wrong, Novgorod would fall. The Crusaders would control the trade routes, the tribute, the churches, everything his family had built, everything the city had meant for 2 centuries. He would become a footnote in the chronicles of German expansion. Dawn came cold and gray, mist rising off the ice, visibility measured in dozens of meters rather than hundreds. Through that mist, across that frozen water, 2 armies began the movements that would decide which faith would be spoken in which language for the next 800 years. The Crusaders formed their wedge. The Russians held their line. And the ice between them, cracking softly in the early spring warmth, waited to see which army would ask too much of it. The first messenger arrived on the morning of April 2nd, 3 days before the battle, and the news he carried was bad. A Russian foraging party had pushed too deep into Livonian territory, chasing cattle or prisoners, or simply the momentum of successful raiding. They'd stumbled into a Crusader patrol near the village of Musta, and the encounter had gone wrong in the way encounters go wrong when light cavalry meets prepared ambush. Domash Tverdislavich, one of Alexander's most experienced commanders, was dead. His men were scattered, some captured, most fled back toward the main force with Germans behind them. Alexander received this report in the forward camp, surrounded by commanders who suddenly looked less confident than they had an hour earlier. The raid had been his idea. Push into Livonian territory, force the enemy to respond, draw them out for a decisive engagement. It had worked. The Crusaders were responding. But the cost of provoking that response had just become personal. Domash had been useful. A veteran who knew how to handle mixed forces, who could keep militia moving in roughly the right direction without the constant supervision that amateur troops usually required. Now he was a corpse somewhere in enemy territory, and the Crusaders knew exactly where the Russian army was positioned. The trap he'd been building had just become visible to the prey. This is the part that the heroic narratives skip over, the hours and days before battle when a commander has to calculate whether his plan still works, after reality has started editing it. Alexander had designed this campaign around a specific sequence: raid Livonian territory, force the order to muster a response, then withdraw to ground of his choosing before that response arrived. Domash's death meant the withdrawal had to happen now, immediately, before the Crusader main force caught his army dispersed and disorganized in hostile territory. He gave the orders within the hour: fall back, consolidate, make for the eastern shore of Lake Peipus. The lake had been his destination from the beginning, though he'd shared that with few of his commanders. To most of them, the retreat looked like prudence, the sensible response to a patrol contact that had turned bloody. Only Alexander and perhaps 2 or 3 others understood that they weren't retreating from danger. They were retreating toward it. Here's what Alexander understood that the Crusaders didn't. The night wedge was not a weapon. It was a bet, a concentrated wager that momentum would break whatever it hit before the hit could be absorbed. On solid ground, with room to build speed and maintain formation. It was the safest bet in medieval warfare. 40 years of Baltic conquest had proven that. But change any variable in the equation, reduce the momentum or compromise the footing, or eliminate the room to maneuver, and suddenly you had several hundred heavily armored men moving slowly in a confined space, which is just a different word for target. The ice changed every variable. Lake Peipus in early April wasn't a frozen highway. It was a gambler's proposition, thick enough near the shores to support weight, thinner and less predictable toward the center, softened everywhere by the early spring warmth that was already eating at its integrity. A man on foot could cross it. A horse could cross it, carefully, at a walk. But a formation of heavy cavalry trying to build the speed necessary for a charge. Every hoofbeat would be a question, and the ice would answer with whatever truth it felt like telling that particular moment. Alexander had studied the lake for days during his approach, sent men out to test depths and surfaces, noted where the ice groaned under their weight and where it held solid. The eastern shore, the Russian shore, offered a narrow stretch where the ice remained thick almost to the waterline. Behind that stretch rose a feature the locals called Raven's Rock, a modest elevation that provided both a reference point and a defensive anchor. Position infantry along that shore, with the rock protecting one flank and the lake itself limiting approach angles, and you created something that wasn't quite a fortress but wasn't open ground either. The Crusaders would have to cross the ice to reach him. Every step of their approach would cost them momentum. By the time they were close enough to charge, their horses would already be tired and uncertain on the treacherous surface. The wedge would still hit. The wedge would still kill. But it wouldn't shatter the line in the first 15 seconds the way it was designed to. And if the line held for even a few minutes, held long enough for the initial charge to spend itself against infantry who weren't running, then the flanks could close. Then the trap would have teeth. The problem was convincing 5,000 men to be the bait. Gavrilo Alexić was the one who voiced what others were thinking. He was one of Alexander's Druzhina commanders, a man who'd earned his position through competence rather than birth, and he had the sort of blunt honesty that princes either value or eventually kill. He found Alexander on the evening of April 3rd, as the army was making camp on the eastern shore, and asked the question directly. "You want the militia to hold the center, against the wedge." It wasn't phrased as a question, but it was. "I want the militia to survive the center," Alexander said. "Holding is what happens after. They're not soldiers. Half of them have never seen a German knight except at a distance. When that wedge comes in, they'll want to run. I know. Which is why they won't have anywhere to run to. The shore is narrow. The rock is behind them. The Druzhina will be on the flanks, not behind them. So there's no line of retreat that doesn't go through the enemy. Gavrilo stared at him for a long moment. You're going to trap our own men so they can't flee. I'm going to make standing the only option that doesn't guarantee death. The wedge kills runners, and everyone knows this. If there's nowhere to run, standing becomes rational. And if they break anyway, if the whole center collapses. Alexander didn't answer immediately. He was looking out at the ice, at the gray expanse that would become a killing ground in 48 hours. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet. Then we all die here, and Novgorod negotiates whatever terms the Bishop of Dorpat feels like offering. But that's true regardless of where we fight. The only question is whether we fight on ground that gives us a chance. Gavrilo didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue further. Some conversations end not because agreement is reached, but because the person with the authority has made their position clear. Alexander had never pretended to be a democratic commander. He listened to advice, weighed perspectives, and then decided. The deciding was his alone. That night, he walked through the militia camps with Spyslav Yakunovich, the boyar who served as his liaison to the Novgorod contingent. Spyslav was a politician more than a soldier, a man who understood how to manage the fragile pride of merchant families who'd sent their sons and workers to die for a city they'd helped expel him from a year earlier. If the militia was going to hold, it would be partly because of whatever Spyslav told them in the hours before battle. The camps were nervous. You could see it in the way men huddled close to their fires, in the quiet conversations that stopped when commanders walked past, in the way eyes kept drifting toward the western horizon as if expecting armored horsemen to materialize from the darkness. These weren't professional soldiers, and they knew it. The blacksmiths and carpenters and tanners who made up Novgorod's militia understood their own limitations better than anyone. They'd trained a few times a year with weapons they owned but rarely used, and now they were being asked to face the most feared cavalry in Northern Europe. Alexander stopped at one fire where a group of younger men were passing around a skin of something that smelled like it could strip paint from wood. They scrambled to their feet when they recognized him, awkward and unsure whether to bow or salute or simply stand there looking terrified. "Sit," he said. "Drink. Tomorrow you'll want to have slept and eaten and done everything else men do before battle. Tonight is for preparing." One of them, bolder or drunker than the others, asked the question they were all thinking. "Can we win, Lord? Against the knights?" Alexander sat down among them, an act that Spyslav clearly found inappropriate but knew better than to interrupt. He accepted the wineskin, took a drink that burned going down, and handed it back. "Let me tell you what's going to happen tomorrow. The Germans will form their wedge on the ice, probably 1,000 meters out. You'll watch them coming, and it will take longer than you expect because their horses can't run properly on the footing. You'll have time to be afraid. Use it. Fear keeps you alert. When they hit our line, men will die. The first rank, probably the second. If you're in those ranks, keep your spear pointed at the horses, not the riders. A wounded horse is a stopped horse, and a stopped horse is a dead knight. Don't try to be heroes. Just make them pay for every meter. After the first impact, everything changes. They'll be among us, but they won't be charging anymore. They'll be trying to cut their way through, and we'll be all around them. Their armor protects them. It also exhausts them. Their horses are terrified. They want to leave. Don't let them. Hold long enough, and the flanks close. The Druzhina hits them from the sides while they're stuck in our midst. And then it's not a battle anymore. It's a harvest." He stood, brushed off his coat, and looked at each of them in turn. "Can we win?" "Yes, but only if you hold. Not forever, not heroically, just long enough for the trap to close. Can you do that?" They said yes. Of course they said yes. What else could they say to their prince the night before battle? But Alexander had watched their faces while he spoke, had seen the fear give way to something else, something that looked almost like understanding. That was all he could ask for. Men who understood the plan had a reason to trust it. Men who trusted the plan might hold long enough for it to work. Might. Across the lake, the Crusaders were having their own council of war, though council was perhaps too generous a term. The Knight brothers of the Livonian Order didn't debate strategy the way Novgorod boyars debated civic policy. They received information, assessed it against doctrine, and implemented the response their training prescribed. The information was straightforward. A Russian army was encamped on the eastern shore of Lake Peipus, positioned near a rock formation that limited their frontage. The army was larger than the Crusader force, perhaps twice the size, but composed primarily of militia with a smaller cavalry contingent. The prince commanding it had recaptured Pskov and raided Livonian territory, killing a German patrol and taking casualties in return. The doctrinal response was equally straightforward: engage, shatter, pursue. The night wedge existed precisely for situations like this, when enemy numbers threatened to overwhelm through mass what they couldn't match in skill. A concentrated strike at the center would break the formation, the broken formation would flee, and the pursuit would convert a tactical victory into a strategic one. Standard procedure. If there was debate, it centered on the ice itself. Some of the older sergeants, men who'd campaigned in the Baltic for years and knew its rhythms, expressed concern about the footing. April ice was unreliable. The lake's surface could support a man, but resist a horse. Building the momentum for a proper charge might be difficult. The Knight brothers listened to these concerns and dismissed them. The ice had held during the approach march. Scouts reported the surface near the Russian position was solid enough for movement. Yes, the footing was imperfect, but the Russians would face the same challenge. And unlike the Russians, the Crusaders had spent years training for exactly this kind of engagement. Their horses knew how to compensate for uncertain ground. Their formations could maintain cohesion even at reduced speeds. The real concern wasn't the ice, it was time. Every day the Russian army sat unmolested on the shore was a day the Crusader reputation suffered. Word of Pskov's recapture had already spread through the region. Estonian and Livonian subjects who'd accepted German rule were watching to see whether the order could respond. If Alexander was allowed to raid and retreat without consequence, those subjects might start having second thoughts about the permanence of their submission. The order couldn't afford a slow campaign, couldn't afford to wait for summer when the ice would be gone and the ground would favor cavalry. Had to strike now, decisively, visibly. Had to demonstrate that the machine still worked. Brother Andreas, if we're to give a name to one of the men who would ride in the wedge, was 32 years old and had been a Knight of the Order for 11 years. He'd killed his first man in a skirmish against pagan Curonians when he was 23, had participated in a dozen campaigns since, had seen the wedge work exactly as designed every single time. He had no reason to doubt it would work again. The night before the battle, he attended Mass with his brothers, confessed his sins, received absolution. The priest who heard his confession reminded him that death in service of Christ was not death, but transformation, that the souls of those who fell fighting pagans and schismatics were guaranteed paradise. Andreas thanked him, and felt the familiar calm that preceded combat settle over him like a cloak. He checked his equipment one final time. Mail sound, helm fitted, sword sharp. His war horse, a destrier he'd trained with for 4 years, stamped and snorted in the cold. The animal could sense his rider's anticipation, the particular tension that meant tomorrow would be different from the quiet days of marching and waiting. They would cross the ice at dawn. They would form the wedge. They would charge. The Russians would break. And by noon, this campaign would be over. Andreas had no way of knowing that he would be dead by mid-morning, dragged from his saddle by men he'd considered barely worth fighting, butchered on ice that was already staining red around him. That future didn't exist yet. For now, there was only the confidence of a man who had bet on the same outcome many times and never lost. Dawn came gray and cold, as it had every morning that week, mist rising off the ice to reduce visibility to perhaps 100 meters. The Crusader army stirred early, broke their fast with bread and dried meat, said final prayers. Horses were led out, saddled, checked, weapons distributed, formations reviewed. On the eastern shore, and the Russian army was already in position, Alexander had roused his men before first light, gotten them moving while the cold was sharpest and the mind was too occupied with discomfort to dwell on fear. The militia formed along the shoreline in dense ranks, shields overlapping, spears bristling forward. They looked, from a distance, like a wall of metal and wood and frightened faces. The Druzhina were on the flanks, hidden as much as possible by the mist and the contours of the shore. Not invisible, but not obvious either. A Crusader scout looking at the Russian position would see the militia center clearly and might miss or underestimate the cavalry positioned at the edges. Alexander took his position on the slight rise behind the right flank, where he could see the whole field and signal his commanders as needed. From there, he watched the mist begin to burn off over the lake, watched the ice emerge gray and white and treacherous in the morning light, and watched the dark mass forming on the western shore begin to move. The Crusaders came out of the mist like a stain spreading across white fabric. First, the auxiliaries, Estonians and Danes, spread across the flanks, moving in loose formation with the uncertain gait of men who didn't trust the ground beneath them. Then, behind them, the wedge. Even at a distance, even knowing what he was seeing, Alexander felt his breath catch. The Knight brothers at the point, perhaps a dozen of the most experienced, most heavily armored men in the formation. Behind them, the sergeants, expanding the wedge into its characteristic shape, lances held vertical for now to avoid tangling. The whole formation moving as a single organism, disciplined, controlled, terrifying. The sound reached the shore before the formation did. Hooves on ice, hundreds of them, creating a resonance that carried across the frozen surface like drum beats from a war party. Beneath that rhythm, the occasional crack and groan of ice protesting the weight, sharp sounds that made men flinch involuntarily, even though they weren't the ones crossing. Alexander's militia heard that sound and shifted. He could see the tremor run through their ranks, the instinctive desire to step backward, to create distance between themselves and the thing approaching. Some of them were praying aloud. Others were gripping their weapons so tightly their knuckles had gone white. A few were simply staring, unfrozen by the spectacle of their own death walking toward them across the ice. "Steady!" The shout came from one of the Novgorod commanders in the center, a man Alexander had positioned there specifically because his voice could carry over battlefield noise. "They come slow, they come tired. Hold your ground, and they break against us." The words helped. Not much, but enough. The line stopped shifting backward. Men straightened, reset their stances, fixed their eyes on the approaching enemy with something approaching determination. The Crusader wedge was 400 meters out now, close enough to make out individual figures, the white cloaks with black crosses, the great helms that turned knights into faceless machines. The formation had begun to accelerate, horses moving from walk to trot, building what momentum the ice would allow. On 300 meters, the Russian archers, positioned in small groups behind the main line, began to loose. Most of their arrows fell short or skittered off armor, but a few found marks in the auxiliary formations on the flanks. An Estonian fighter went down, clutching at a shaft in his thigh. Another dropped without a sound, the arrow having found the gap between his helm and his collar. The auxiliaries hesitated, their formation rippling with uncertainty. They weren't the target of the main charge, but they were supposed to pin the Russian flanks, keep the militia from escaping to the sides when the wedge hit. If they wavered, the whole battle plan changed. But the Knight brothers didn't waver. The wedge kept coming, 200 meters now, and the knights at the point couched their lances, brought them down from vertical to horizontal. He aimed at the mass of Russian infantry ahead. 100 meters. Close enough now for the men in the Russian front rank to see the faces of the horses bearing down on them, the wide eyes and flared nostrils and bared teeth of animals trained to trample whatever stood before them. Close enough to see the lance points, to see the knights shifting their weight forward for the impact, to see death coming at them faster than a man could run. 50 meters. Hold! The scream came from somewhere in the Russian line, echoed by a dozen other voices, a raw, desperate command that was less instruction than prayer. The wedge hit. The sound arrived before the impact, a rolling thunder of hooves on frozen water that seemed to come from everywhere at once, resonating through the ice, up through the feet of the men standing on the shore, into their bones. The Russian front rank could feel the charge before they could properly see it, could feel the accumulated weight of horse and steel and 40 years of Crusader confidence bearing down on them through the vibrating surface beneath their boots. Then the mist parted, and there it was. The wedge emerged from the gray like something out of a nightmare given tactical form. 12 knights at the point, their destriers now at a canter that was accelerating toward a gallop despite the treacherous footing. Behind them, the formation widened in disciplined echelons, sergeants and men-at-arms spreading backward and outward, creating that distinctive pig's head shape that had broken every enemy it had ever faced. White cloaks snapped in the wind of their own momentum. Lance points caught the pale morning light, and the black crosses on their chests seemed to absorb what little color remained in the world. 50 meters out, the front rank of Russian militia began to die in imagination, before they died in fact. Some of them closed their eyes. Others screamed prayers or curses or nothing at all, just raw sound escaping through clenched throats. A few simply stood, too terrified to do anything but witness their own extinction approaching at 30 kilometers per hour. The knights couched their lances in the final seconds, tucking the shafts under their arms, aiming the points at the mass of flesh and wood ahead. At this distance, at this speed, aiming barely mattered. The first rank was a wall, and a lance will find something in a wall. Impact. The first knight through was a man whose name is lost to history, but whose lance is not. It struck a Novgorod tanner named Mikula in the center of his chest, punched through the leather armor he'd been so proud of, exited through his spine, and continued into the man behind him before the shaft snapped from the combined resistance. Mikula was dead before his body understood it, his heart torn in half by a weapon designed for exactly this purpose. He stayed upright for a strange, frozen moment, pinned to the man behind him by the broken lance, and then both of them crumpled as the knight released the useless shaft and drew his sword in one practiced motion. The second knight struck a raised shield that shattered under the impact, driving splinters into the face of its owner and the lance point into his shoulder. He spun, screaming, and went down under the hooves of the third horse through the breach. The sound he made when the weight came down was the sound of a melon breaking, wet and final, and over quickly. The wedge drove into the Russian center like a fist into bread. Men flew backward from impacts they couldn't have resisted if they'd had a wall behind them. Horses, trained to attack as much as their riders, bit and struck at the infantry swarming around them. Swords came down in silver arcs and came up red. The first rank of militia ceased to exist as a formation in perhaps 8 seconds. But they didn't run. This is what Alexander had gambled on, the thing he couldn't know for certain until the moment arrived. The militia had nowhere to go. The shore was narrow, the rock formation blocked one flank, and the press of their own comrades behind them made retreat physically impossible. Running wasn't an option because there was no space to run into. Standing was the only thing left, and so they stood. The wedge pushed deeper, killing as it went, but the killing was starting to cost time. Each man who fell had to be ridden over or around. Each knot of resistance, even momentary, slowed the horses that had already lost much of their momentum on the icy approach. The formation that had entered the militia line as a unified striking force began to fragment into individual combats. Knights surrounded by enemies they were still killing, but no longer sweeping aside. Andreas von Velven was in the third rank of the wedge, and by the time he reached the point of contact, the clean breakthrough he'd expected was already becoming something else. He saw a knight ahead of him take a spear thrust to the face as his horse stumbled on a body, the point entering through the vision slit of his great helm with a sound Andreas would remember until his own death 20 minutes later. The knight toppled sideways, and his horse, suddenly riderless and panicked, crashed into Andreas's mount and nearly unseated him. He regained his balance, cut down at a Russian who was trying to grab his reins, felt the sword bite through the man's upraised arm at the elbow. The hand stayed attached to the reins as the man fell away, and Andreas had to kick it free, an absurd moment of disgust in the middle of murder. Then another Russian was there, and another, and suddenly it wasn't a charge anymore. It was a siege in miniature, and he was the castle, and Alexander watched from his position behind the right flank, and what he saw was the wedge dying by degrees. Not physically, not yet, but tactically. The formation had penetrated perhaps 30 meters into the militia line, leaving a wake of dead and dying Russians behind it. But the penetration had stopped. The knights at the point were fighting for their lives instead of pushing forward. The sergeants behind them were bunching up, unable to advance, starting to look for space to use their weapons. The whole mass of the Crusader force was compressing into a tighter and tighter space as the rear ranks continued forward into a front that had stopped moving. They'd hit the sponge. Now, it was time to close the trap. He turned to the messenger waiting beside him, a young man on a fast horse whose only job was to carry one word to the Druzhina commanders on the flanks. Now. The Russian cavalry came in from both sides simultaneously, 300 horsemen on the left, 200 on the right, moving from their concealed positions at the edge of the battlefield toward the Crusader flanks. They didn't charge the way the knights had charged, didn't form wedges of their own. They came in waves, loose and fast, aiming for the auxiliary troops that were supposed to be protecting the knights' sides. The Estonian fighters on the left flank never had a chance. They'd been conscripts before the battle, men fighting for masters they didn't love, and the sight of Russian cavalry bearing down on them while their knights were mired in the center was more than their loyalty could survive. Some turned and ran immediately. Others tried to form a defensive line, but were swept away before they could set themselves. The left flank collapsed in perhaps 90 seconds, leaving nothing between the Russian cavalry and the Crusader wedge but churned ice and abandoned weapons. The right flank held longer, partly because the Danish auxiliaries there had better discipline, partly because the terrain forced the Russian horsemen to approach more slowly. But it held for minutes, not hours, and minutes weren't enough. When it broke completely, fighters streaming back toward the western shore while Russian cavalrymen rode them down one by one. Gavrilo Aleksich led the right flank attack, and he was among the first to reach the Crusader formation itself. His target wasn't a knight, and wasn't one of the armored figures still fighting surrounded by militia. It was a sergeant trying to wheel his horse toward the new threat, a man whose attention was divided between the enemies in front of him and the enemies now appearing beside him. Gavrilo hit him at an angle, his sword catching the sergeant across the back of the neck, where mail gave way to exposed skin. The cut wasn't clean, had to be followed by a second stroke, but the sergeant was falling before the second stroke landed. His horse bolted, crashing into another horse, spreading chaos through a formation that was already losing coherence. Inside the wedge, the knights were beginning to understand what had happened. The flanks were gone. The auxiliaries who should have protected their retreat were dead or fleeing. They were surrounded now, hundreds of Russian infantry on all sides, Russian cavalry cutting off any escape, and the same ice that had slowed their charge was now trapping them in place. A knight without momentum is just a man in expensive armor. Expensive armor that weighs 30 kilograms, that turns every movement into a negotiation with exhaustion, that makes remounting a fallen horse nearly impossible without help. The knights of the Livonian Order were still killing, still dangerous, still taking Russian lives with every swing of their swords. But they were no longer winning. Brother Andreas found himself back to back with another knight, a man whose name he couldn't remember in the chaos, fighting off a circle of enemies that grew denser with every passing minute. His sword arm was starting to burn with the effort of repeated strikes. His horse was bleeding from a dozen small wounds, still moving but sluggish now, reluctant to turn the way he needed it to turn. A Russian fighter, one of the militia by his equipment, lunged toward him with a spear. Andreas knocked the thrust aside, but the deflection left him open on his right, and another Russian was already there with an axe. The axe caught him on the thigh, didn't penetrate the mail, but crushed the flesh beneath it, with the kind of deep bruising that would have made walking agony if walking had been possible. His horse chose that moment to die, not dramatically, not from a single killing blow, but from accumulated damage and terror, and the simple exhaustion of carrying an armored man through an endless fight. The destrier's front legs buckled, and Andreas found himself sliding forward over the animal's neck, throwing out his hands to catch himself, hitting the ice on all fours like a supplicant before an altar. Hands grabbed him before he could rise. Russian hands, 4 of them or 6 or 8, seizing his arms, his helm, the mail at his collar. He tried to fight, but there was no leverage. Tried to reach for a weapon, but his sword was gone, had fallen somewhere in the fall. Someone was pulling at his great helm, wrenching it back and forth, trying to tear it free. The helm came off. Cold air hit his sweat-soaked face, and for a moment he could see clearly for the first time since the charge began. He could see the face of the man who was about to kill him, a Novgorod craftsman with a beard going gray and eyes that held no hatred, only the grim concentration of a man doing necessary work. The knife entered under his jaw and angled upward toward his brain. The pain was brief. Alexander didn't see Andreas die. He was watching the broader picture, the way a man watches a fire consume a building without tracking each individual flame. The Crusader formation had ceased to exist as a tactical unit. What remained was perhaps 200 men in a shrinking space, knights and sergeants fighting back-to-back in clumps of 3 or 4, cutting down Russians but being pulled from their horses one by one, the ice around them turning into a slaughterhouse floor of churned red slush. The militia, the craftsmen and farmers he'd positioned as bait, were fighting with the desperate energy of men who'd expected to die and discovered they were still alive. They'd taken horrific casualties in the initial charge, perhaps 300 dead in the first few minutes, but the survivors had found something in themselves that training couldn't have given them. They'd held. Against the night wedge, against the most feared weapon in Northern Europe, they'd held. Now they were paying the knights back. A knot of 6 knights near the center of the crush had formed a defensive circle, horses facing outward, swords working in coordinated patterns that kept the Russians at bay. They were the last organized resistance on the field, the final fragment of discipline in a battle that had become a feeding frenzy. If they could hold until the press around them thinned, if they could cut their way free and make for the western shore, at least some of the Order's strength might survive. Alexander saw them. He saw what they were trying to do, and he made a decision that would cost Russian lives but end the battle. Gavrilo, the center, break them. The Druzhina commander looked at the knot of knights, looked at the militia already swarming around them, understood what his prince was asking. A cavalry charge into that mass would kill Russians as surely as Germans. The horses couldn't distinguish between enemies and friends in the press. But a cavalry charge would also shatter the last resistance, would end any hope of an organized Crusader withdrawal. He didn't hesitate. The Druzhina had been waiting for exactly this moment, the chance to do what cavalry was meant to do. He gathered perhaps 50 riders, the closest ones available, and led them straight into the center of the remaining battle. The impact was catastrophic for everyone it touched. Russian militia died under friendly hooves. Knights died under enemy swords as their defensive formation was torn apart by horsemen who didn't care about elegant swordplay, who simply crashed through and kept going. The knot of 6 became 5, became 3, became one man fighting alone on a dying horse, surrounded by enemies who were finally too many. That man was the last knight to fall on the ice. He didn't surrender, didn't try to negotiate capture and ransom. He fought until a Druzhina rider caught him from behind with an axe blow to the base of his skull, and then he stopped fighting forever. The battle was over. The slaughter was just beginning. "Kill them on the ice! Kill them in the water! Let none reach the western shore!" The shout came from somewhere in the Russian line, and it was picked up and repeated, spreading through an army that had been terrified an hour ago, and now had discovered what the other side of terror felt like. The Crusader survivors, perhaps 400 men scattered across a kilometer of ice, were running, not retreating in good order, not conducting a fighting withdrawal, running. And the Russians pursued. Alexander didn't join the chase. He remained on the shore, watching his army transform into a hunting pack, watching the ice become a killing ground that stretched toward the western horizon. The mist was gone now, burned off by a sun that had finally broken through the clouds, and he could see everything. Could see the individual pursuits, the moments when a fleeing sergeant stumbled and was overtaken, the knots of resistance that formed and dissolved as exhausted men tried to stand together and were swept away. The pursuit continued for 7 kilometers across the lake. Versts, in the Russian measurement of the time, 7 versts of running and killing and dying on ice that groaned and cracked beneath the weight of violence it was being asked to bear. Some of the ice gave way during the chase, dropping men into water so cold it killed as surely as any sword. Not many. Not the mass drownings that later legend would invent, but enough that witnesses remembered it, that the image of armored men vanishing through dark holes became part of the story that survivors would tell. Gavrilo's horse went through one of those weak spots, plunging into water up to the animal's chest before the ice gave way entirely. He managed to throw himself clear, rolled across solid ice as his horse thrashed and screamed behind him, and scrambled to his feet just as a Russian infantryman reached him with a hand outstretched to help. "Lord, are you hurt?" He wasn't hurt. He was soaked and freezing, and his horse was drowning 20 meters away. But he wasn't hurt. He let the man pull him to his feet, watched his horse's struggle slow and stop as the cold took it, and felt nothing at all. Shock, probably. Later he would feel everything. On the western shore, the survivors of the Crusader army reached land in ones and twos, not hundreds. Some had escaped early, auxiliaries who'd fled before the encirclement was complete. Some were knights who'd cut their way free during the chaos, covered in blood that was mostly not their own, riding horses that were barely functional. Most of them simply walked out of the lake and kept walking, not stopping until they reached the first Livonian settlement miles away. Behind them, the lake was quiet. Alexander walked onto the ice for the first time since the battle began. Around him, Russian fighters were moving among the fallen, checking for survivors, finishing the wounded, stripping the dead of anything valuable. The work was conducted with the efficient brutality of men who had learned what it felt like to kill and wanted to be done with it. The scale of what had happened was visible now in a way it hadn't been during the fighting. Bodies scattered across hundreds of meters of ice, some alone, some in piles where resistance had concentrated. Horses, dozens of them, lying in grotesque positions, legs broken, guts spilled, eyes already glazing in the cold. Blood everywhere, not the bright red of fresh wounds, but the darker shades of blood that had time to spread and cool and soak into the snow. He found a white cloak near what had been the center of the Crusader formation. The man wearing it was face down, his arms spread as if he'd been trying to embrace the ice when he fell. Alexander turned him over with his foot. The knight's face was young, perhaps 25, frozen now into an expression that might have been surprise or peace, depending on how you chose to read it. 20 of them, according to the count that was already beginning. 20 knight brothers of the Livonian Order, dead on the ice. 6 more captured, wounded but alive, valuable now in ways they hadn't been an hour ago. For the Order, this was catastrophe. 40 years of expansion, hundreds of kilometers of conquered territory. And now, nearly a third of their knight brothers in the region were gone in a single afternoon. The sergeants and auxiliaries didn't count for the same reckoning, but they counted. 300 Germans killed, maybe more, the number's hard to establish, when bodies were scattered across kilometers of ice, and some had vanished through holes that had since refrozen. 500 Estonians and Danes, or 1,000, the chroniclers would disagree. The Crusader force that had ridden onto the ice that morning expecting routine victory had been destroyed. Russian losses were harder to know and easier to minimize. The militia had borne the worst of it. 300 dead at least, probably closer to 500 when the dying finished over the next few days. Druzhina casualties were lighter, 50 or 60, men who knew how to fight and had been positioned where fighting was survivable. Novgorod would mourn, but Novgorod would mourn fewer than its enemies. Alexander stood among the dead as the afternoon shadows lengthened across the ice, surrounded by the aftermath of what he had built. not glory. Glory was for songs. This was meat and metal, was the sound of men groaning who wouldn't survive the night, was the smell of blood and horse and waste that would linger in his memory for the rest of his life. Lord? One of his commanders, approaching carefully, reading his prince's stillness as something requiring caution. The prisoners, what should we do with them? The 6 captured knights were being held near the shore, stripped of their weapons but not their dignity, guarded by Druzhina, who understood that these men were worth more alive than dead. Ransom, negotiation, the currency of medieval warfare, applicable even here, even now. Bind them, feed them, keep them warm. Alexander's voice sounded strange to his own ears, flat and distant. They walk to Novgorod tomorrow. Let the city see what we've taken. The commander nodded and withdrew to give the orders. Alexander remained where he was, looking out across the ice toward the western shore, toward the territory that was still Crusader, still hostile, still there. He could pursue. The thought crossed his mind, as it had crossed his mind before the battle. The Livonian Order was broken. Their best men were dead or captured. Their fortresses were undermanned, their subjects demoralized, their reputation shattered. A campaign now, oppressed with the momentum of victory, could roll back 40 years of conquest, could reach Riga itself, could end the Northern Crusade on this frontier forever. He didn't move, because 1,500 kilometers to the east, Batu Khan was waiting for his tribute, because the Mongol envoys would arrive in Novgorod within the year, expecting submission and payment, and the demonstrations of loyalty that kept the Golden Horde satisfied. Because Alexander could win here, on this ice, against this enemy. But he could not win everywhere. The Crusaders would recover. They would rebuild, recruit new knights, re-establish their garrisons. In a generation, they might try again. But they wouldn't try today. They wouldn't try this year. They might never try against Novgorod again, not after this. That would have to be enough. And the sun was setting by the time the Russian army began its withdrawal, leaving the ice to the dead and the crows that were already circling. The prisoners walked in the center of the column, barefoot by tradition, a humiliation that was also a practical guarantee against escape. The wounded rode in carts that jolted over frozen ground, their groans providing a constant accompaniment to the march. Alexander rode at the head of the column, and if anyone expected triumph, expected the victorious prince to celebrate his achievement, they were disappointed. His face was closed, turned toward the road ahead, toward the city that had expelled him and begged him back, and now owed him everything it would never fully repay. Behind him, on a lake already beginning to soften in the late April warmth, the bodies of Germans and Russians lay together in the democracy of death. Within weeks, the ice would release them. Some would wash up on shores where their families would never find them. Others would sink to the bottom of a lake that would hold their bones for centuries. April 5th, 1242, Lake Peipus. The day the Northern Crusade learned that there were limits to what cavalry and faith could conquer. The cost had been paid. All that remained was collecting what it bought. The prisoners entered Novgorod on April 12th, 1 week after the battle, and the city that had expelled Alexander 18 months earlier lined the streets to watch them pass. 6 knight brothers of the Livonian Order, still wearing the remnants of their white cloaks, walked barefoot through the mud while Novgorod citizens threw things at them. Rotten vegetables, mostly. Some stones. The missiles weren't intended to kill, just to humiliate, to demonstrate that the men who'd terrorized the Baltic for 40 years were now property to be paraded and mocked. Alexander rode at the head of the column, And if he took pleasure in the spectacle, his face didn't show it. He looked the way men look after battles, the way they look when the survival instinct that carried them through the killing has finally relaxed its grip and left them alone with what they've done. Exhausted, hollow, present in body, while some essential part of the mind was still back on the ice, still watching men die, still making the calculations that sent them to their deaths. The vetch received him with honors that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. The same merchants who'd voted to expel him now competed to praise his wisdom, his courage, his indispensable service to the city. They gave him gifts, they gave him titles, they gave him everything except the one thing that might have mattered, an acknowledgement that they'd been wrong. He accepted it all with the same flat expression he'd worn since the battle. Then he went home, and for 3 days he didn't emerge, didn't receive visitors, didn't participate in the celebrations that continued without him. His wife, a woman named Alexandra, whose voice appears nowhere in the Chronicles, probably knew something about what those 3 days contained. No one else did. No one else needed to. This is what victory costs when you're 21 years old and you've just killed several hundred people to save a city that threw you away. The songs don't mention the 3 days. They skip straight to the triumph. The Crusaders paid their own price, though it took longer to calculate. The Livonian Order didn't collapse after Peipus. It couldn't afford to collapse. Too much territory, too many obligations, too many enemies who would sense weakness and exploit it. Within months, the surviving Knight brothers were back in their fortresses, recruiting new men from Germany, rebuilding the structures that had taken a generation to create. But something had changed. Not the Order's capacity, not its resources, not its ambition, its confidence. For 40 years, the Knight wedge had never failed. Now it had failed, catastrophically, against an enemy that was supposed to be disorganized and weak. And the men who rebuilt the Order after Peipus were not the men who'd ridden onto the ice expecting routine victory. They were men who'd learned that routine victories could turn into annihilation in the span of a morning. The peace treaty came quickly, signed within months of the battle. Its terms were modest by the standards of medieval conquest. The Livonians withdrew from the territories they'd occupied. Pskov and Novgorod remained Russian. The pre-war borders were restored. No indemnities, no territorial transfers, no punishment beyond the return to the status quo. Alexander could have demanded more. He didn't. The prisoners were ransomed and returned. The fortresses he'd demolished weren't rebuilt, but the fortresses that remained were left alone. The Order kept what it had conquered before 1240, and Novgorod kept what it had always held, and the frontier between Catholic West and Orthodox East was established along a line that would persist for centuries. This restraint puzzled some of his commanders. They'd won. They'd broken the Crusader advance so completely that the survivors would remember it for generations. Why not press the advantage? Why not roll back the conquests, liberate the Estonians and Livonians, push the Germans to the sea? Alexander didn't explain. He didn't need to explain. He simply negotiated the terms he wanted and let his commanders draw their own conclusions. The conclusion they should have drawn, but probably didn't, was that Alexander had never been fighting for conquest. He'd been fighting for time to stabilize the western frontier, time to demonstrate that Novgorod couldn't be absorbed, time to create the buffer he needed before the real negotiations began. Because 5 months after the battle on the ice, Mongol envoys arrived in Vladimir, demanding that the Russian princes present themselves before Batu Khan. Alexander's father, Yaroslav, made the journey in 1243. He returned in 1246, having spent months at the Mongol court, having knelt and accepted the Khan's authority, having secured the right to continue ruling as a Mongol vassal. He died on the way home, probably poisoned. The Chronicles hint, but don't confirm. Alexander was summoned to the Mongol court in 1247, and again in 1252, and again in 1258. He went every time. He knelt every time. He paid the tribute, supplied the soldiers when demanded, enforced Mongol authority over his own people when rebellion threatened to bring annihilation. The man who destroyed Crusader knights on a frozen lake spent the rest of his life bowing to rulers who made the Livonian Order look like a neighborhood nuisance. This is the irony that the heroic narratives can't contain. Alexander Nevsky, the defender of Orthodox Russia against Western aggression, was also Alexander Nevsky, the enforcer of Eastern domination. He crushed revolts against Mongol taxation in Novgorod itself, using the same military skill that had won Peipus to suppress his own people. He collaborated with an empire that had killed hundreds of thousands of Russians because collaboration was the only path to survival. History doesn't do complexity well. It wants heroes and villains, clean lines between the forces of good and the forces of evil. Alexander Nevsky was neither. He was a survivor, operating in a world where the choices were submission or annihilation, picking his moments of resistance with the cold precision of a man who understood that pride was a luxury he couldn't afford. The Crusaders he could fight because fighting them was possible. The Mongols he couldn't fight because fighting them was suicide. Both decisions came from the same calculation. What does survival require? The battle on the ice wasn't an act of defiance against foreign aggression. It was an act of triage, dealing with the threat that could be dealt with while managing the threat that couldn't. He died in 1263, on the road home from his fourth or fifth trip to the Mongol court. He was 42 years old. The Chronicles say he took monastic vows on his deathbed, became a monk in his final hours. He secured his soul's passage with a last-minute conversion to the religious life. This was standard practice for medieval princes. It doesn't tell us much about his actual faith. What happened next tells us everything about what he meant. The Russian Orthodox Church canonized him as a saint. The process was gradual, not the formal canonization that later centuries would institute, but the organic growth of veneration that transforms a dead prince into a holy protector. Miracles were reported at his tomb. His relics were preserved and displayed. His feast day entered the calendar, April 12th, the day he'd returned to Novgorod with his prisoners. The church's Alexander Nevsky was a defender of the faith, a warrior who'd protected Orthodox Russia from Catholic Crusaders, a saint whose intercession could still be sought in times of danger. This version of the man was true. It was also radically incomplete. The parts about Mongol collaboration, about crushing Novgorod's resistance to tribute collection, about the decades of submission that followed the hours of glory, those parts didn't fit the narrative. So they were minimized, explained away, eventually forgotten. For 600 years, Alexander Nevsky existed primarily as a religious figure, a saint whose historical details mattered less than his symbolic function. Then, in 1938, Stalin needed a hero. Nazi Germany was rising. War was coming. The Soviet Union needed stories that would make its people willing to fight, to sacrifice, to endure the unimaginable suffering that everyone could see approaching. And Soviet ideology had a problem. It had spent 2 decades rejecting Russian history, dismissing everything before the revolution as feudal oppression to be transcended and forgotten. But you can't fight a war without a past. You can't ask people to die for abstractions. Stalin understood this the way he understood everything, with the ruthless clarity of a man who viewed human psychology as a resource to be exploited. Russia needed heroes, not Soviet heroes, because the Soviet Union was only 20 years old. Russian heroes from the deep history that the revolution had tried to erase. Alexander Nevsky was perfect. He'd fought Germans. He'd won. He'd defended Russia against Western invasion. The Mongol collaboration could be downplayed or reframed as diplomatic necessity. The religious aspects could be stripped out and replaced with secular patriotism. What remained was exactly what Stalin needed: a medieval prince who'd crushed German invaders on Russian soil. Sergei Eisenstein made the film in 1938, working under direct Kremlin supervision, knowing that deviation from the approved narrative could mean his death. The movie he created was propaganda of the highest order, beautiful and terrifying and completely untethered from historical accuracy. The battle scenes were filmed in summer heat, with artificial snow, creating images that bore no relationship to what actually happened on Lake Peipus. The drowning knights, icons of the film, were invented wholesale. The dialogue was written by Soviet screenwriters, putting modern sentiments in medieval mouths. Those who come to us with the sword will die by the sword. Alexander Nevsky never said this. No medieval source contains it. Then the line was written in 1938 for a film designed to prepare Soviet citizens for a war against Germany. It worked. The film was enormously popular, was pulled from theaters briefly during the Nazi-Soviet pact, then re-released after Germany invaded in 1941. Soviet soldiers went into battle against the Wehrmacht with Eisenstein's images in their heads, with the invented words of a 13th century prince on their lips. This is how history actually operates, not as a faithful record of what happened, but as a quarry from which each generation extracts the materials it needs. The real Alexander Nevsky, the 21-year-old who gambled everything on ice that might not hold, who spent his remaining years bowing to Mongol overlords, who died exhausted and compromised on a road in the Russian wilderness, to that man served his purpose and was discarded. What remained was the image, the symbol, the useful lie. The useful lie outlasted the Soviet Union. Today, the Order of Alexander Nevsky is one of Russia's highest military decorations, awarded for exceptional service in defense of the fatherland. Alexander Nevsky cathedrals stand in cities across the former Russian Empire. His face appears on stamps, on currency, on the propaganda of a government that has found him just as useful as Stalin did. Meanwhile, the lake itself keeps its secrets. Archaeologists have searched for the battle site for decades, using ground-penetrating radar, underwater cameras, the full arsenal of modern investigation. They've found nothing conclusive. No mass graves, no concentrations of weapons, no physical evidence that would pin the battle to a specific location on a lake whose shoreline has shifted over 8 centuries. This isn't unusual for medieval battles. Most of them leave no trace that survives the centuries. But it contributes to the strange quality of the battle on the ice, the sense that it exists more in memory than in material reality. We know it happened. We know roughly where and roughly when and roughly what the outcome was. Beyond that, we have chronicles written decades later, filtered through the agendas of the writers, contradicting each other on details that would seem fundamental. How many men fought? The sources disagree by factors of 2 or 3. How many died? Same problem. Did anyone actually drown through the ice? The earliest sources don't mention it. What exactly was Alexander's tactical plan? A reconstruction and inference, plausible but unprovable. The battle that shaped the religious and cultural boundary of Europe for 800 years is, in its specifics, almost entirely uncertain. What we know is this: something happened on Lake Peipus in April 1242 that convinced the Livonian Order to never attempt another major invasion of Novgorod's territory. Something happened that made Alexander Nevsky's reputation permanent, that gave him the political capital to spend the rest of his life collaborating with Mongols while being remembered as a defender against foreign aggression. Something happened that mattered, even if we can't reconstruct exactly what it was. The ripples spread for centuries. The frontier established after Peipus became the border between Orthodox East and Catholic West, a line that persisted through the Russian Empire, through the Soviet Union, through the collapse of communism, and into the present day. Estonia and Latvia, conquered by the Crusaders in the 13th century, remained culturally Western. Russia, defended at Peipus and elsewhere, remained culturally distinct. The schism that the battle represented never healed. In 1942, exactly 700 years after the battle, the Soviet government established the Order of Alexander Nevsky to honor officers who demonstrated tactical excellence in combat against Nazi Germany. The medal featured a profile of the Saint Prince, and the citation described it as rewarding those who had shown the leadership, courage, and dedication of Alexander Nevsky in the defense of the motherland. Thousands of soldiers received it during the Great Patriotic War, fighting Germans on some of the same ground their ancestors had fought 7 centuries earlier. The Germans knew the story too. Nazi propaganda occasionally referenced the Northern Crusade as evidence of an ancient German mission to civilize the East, though the parallel was awkward given how the original crusade had ended. The Teutonic Order itself still existed in 1942, reduced from a military power to a charitable organization, but symbolically available for appropriation by a regime that specialized in appropriating symbols. The knights who'd frozen on Peipus were refigured as early victims of Slavic barbarism, martyrs to a civilizing mission that the Third Reich would finally complete. They didn't complete it. The Eastern Front became the graveyard of Nazi ambitions, a killing ground that consumed German armies the way Peipus had consumed Crusader knights, though on a scale that made Peipus look like a skirmish. When the last German soldiers surrendered at Stalingrad, when Soviet tanks rolled into Berlin, the propaganda machine on both sides reached back to the same 13th century battle for precedent and meaning. 2 armies fighting in the ruins of 1945, and both of them thinking about a frozen lake in 1242. That's how deep the ripples went. The Cold War continued the pattern. When Soviet ideologists needed to explain the essential hostility between East and West, they pointed to the Northern Crusade as proof that Western aggression was timeless, that the capitalist powers were simply the latest iteration of the same Germanic drive to conquer and convert. When Western ideologists needed to explain Russian paranoia and aggression, they pointed to the Mongol conquest as proof that Russia had never really been part of European civilization, that centuries of Eastern domination had created a culture fundamentally alien to Western values. Both interpretations were self-serving. Both contained elements of truth, and both traced their arguments back to the 13th century, to a period when the choices Russian princes made determined which direction their civilization would face for the next millennium. Alexander Nevsky chose. He fought the West and submitted to the East. He preserved Russian orthodoxy at the cost of Russian independence. He saved Novgorod from the Crusaders so that he could tax it for the Mongols. The contradictions don't resolve. They simply coexist, The way contradictions always coexist in people who have to make impossible choices with inadequate information under unbearable pressure. The lake doesn't care about any of this. Lake Peipus still freezes in winter, still thaws in spring, still shifts its shoreline with the patient indifference of geological time. The bones of the men who died there in 1242 have long since dissolved into the sediment. The swords and spears and armor rusted away centuries ago. Nothing remains except the water and the ice and the stories people tell about what happened on a cold April morning when two ideas about the world collided and one of them didn't survive. Here's what we're left with 800 years later. Not certainty about what happened, not agreement about what it meant. Just the persistent fact that something happened, something that mattered, something that people have been fighting over in memory ever since. Alexander Nevsky would probably recognize the pattern. He'd spent his life being used by forces larger than himself, the Church and the Mongols and the merchants of Novgorod and all the other powers that saw in him a tool for their purposes. He'd learned to work within that reality, to extract what survival he could from a world that didn't care about his preferences, that his memory would be used the same way, endlessly repurposed for whatever cause needed a 13th century prince, would probably strike him as grimly appropriate. The statue of Alexander Nevsky in St. Petersburg shows him on horseback, sword raised, facing west. It was erected in 2002, on the anniversary of his birth, commissioned by a Russian government that had its own reasons for emphasizing Western threats and Russian resistance. The pose is heroic, triumphant, everything the actual man probably wasn't in the moment it's supposed to represent. Statues lie that way. They have to. A statue showing a 21-year-old vomiting from the smell of the battlefield wouldn't serve the same purpose. But somewhere beneath the statue, beneath the city, beneath the accumulated weight of 8 centuries of interpretation and appropriation and myth, there's still the frozen lake, still the morning mist, still the sound of hooves on ice, hollow and wrong, approaching too fast to outrun. And still, at the center of it all, a young man who understood one thing clearly. The ground you fight on matters more than the army you fight with. The wedge was coming. The wedge always comes, in every age, wearing different armor, carrying different banners, absolutely certain of its own invincibility. And the only question that matters is whether you've chosen ground where certainty can break. He chose frozen water in April. He bet everything on the idea that what had always worked would stop working if you change the conditions underneath it. He was right. That's the truth the myth obscures, and the history reveals. Alexander Nevsky didn't win because he was braver or holier or more Russian than his enemies. He won because he paid attention to the ice. He won because he understood that the most fearsome weapon in the world is still subject to physics, still dependent on conditions, still vulnerable to a commander who thinks about footing when everyone else is thinking about glory. The knights who died on Lake Peipus weren't cowards or fools. They were professionals who followed a doctrine that had never failed. They rode onto that ice expecting the same outcome they'd achieved 100 times before. They were wrong, and being wrong cost them everything. And the lesson their deaths taught has been taught again in every century since. The invincible force isn't invincible. The unstoppable momentum can be stopped. The empire that has never known defeat is just an empire that hasn't met the right conditions yet. April 5th, 1242. Dawn on a frozen lake. A young prince with an army of craftsmen and a theory about ice. And against him, the most sophisticated military machine in Northern Europe. Absolutely certain that what was about to happen couldn't happen. The mist cleared. The wedge charged. The ice held long enough for the trap to close, and then it didn't matter what anyone was certain about anymore. If you made it this far, you've spent more time with the battle on the ice than most history students ever do. So here's my question. What other certainties of our own age are waiting to meet conditions that will break them? Drop your answers in the comments. And if you want to see how another empire learned the same lesson the hard way, the video appearing on your screen right now tells the story of a force even more invincible than the night wedge and the frozen ground that destroyed it.